My name is Daniel Hart. I am a retired detective from Longview, Washington. For 30 years, I had one unsolved question that kept me awake more than any other. Where is Rima Traxler? If you've lived long enough, you know this much. Not all ghosts rattle chains. Some just keep leaving the porch light on in your head, night after night, because you promised a set of tired parents that you would bring their little girl home. I made that promise in 1985, when I was young enough to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to beat a man like Joseph Kondro. I was wrong, but this isn't just a story about failure. It's about a password that should have saved a child and instead betrayed her. It's about the way something as innocent as a unicorn can be twisted in the mouth of a patient predator. And it's about the moment, years later, when the case came back from the dead and dragged my life and my sanity along with it. The last time anyone saw Rima alive, she was walking home from St. Helens Elementary School with a cardboard art project clutched to her chest. It was one of those bright May afternoons when the rain finally gives up and the sun lays itself across the wet sidewalks like a promise. She stopped 2 blocks from home to show a neighbor her work cut-out construction paper, glitter that would probably haunt their carpet for weeks, a unicorn with a rainbow mane. She was so proud. The neighbor told us that first night, voice trembling, hands twisting a dish towel. She said, "Look, it's my unicorn, like the password." I didn't know what she meant. When you work missing child cases, you learn to catalog details without letting them pierce you, not yet anyway. You write down unicorn. You write down rainbow beret. You write down tan plaid skirt, pink shirt, white tights, brown clogs, and you keep moving. You don't let yourself imagine what those tights will look like after a night in the woods, or whether the beret will still be bright when the search dogs find it. Back then, in 1985, I was only 3 years into the job and still believed every missing kid could be found if you just moved fast enough. By the time my sergeant barked Rima's name across the squad room, we were already behind. 8-year-old girl, Longview address, didn't make it home from school, he said. Parents? I asked. Stepfather's frantic, mom's in shock. They've already done the walk themselves, called the neighbors, called us. Let's go. The Traxler's house sat on a quiet street that smelled like wet grass and motor oil. There was a swing in the front yard, gently turning in the evening air. Over the years, I would stare at that swing more times than I care to admit, wondering if Rima had pumped her legs there that very morning, if she'd looked at the sky and thought about unicorns and passwords, and all the things that made her feel safe. Inside, the living room was a collage of family life. School photos on the wall, a cluttered coffee table, a laundry basket half folded. Rima's mother, Linda, sat on the sofa, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her body together. Her eyes were red, rimmed, but dry, emptied out. Her husband, Gary, paced the room, fingers raking through his hair. "You're sure she didn't go to a friend's house?" My partner, McDaniel, asked gently. "We called everyone," Linda whispered. "Every parent, every number in her notebook. Nobody's seen her since school let out." Gary turned to me. "She would never just run off. She's not that kind of kid. She knows the rules. We were careful. We did everything they tell you to do." "What kind of rules?" I asked. Gary hesitated, glanced at Linda, then back at me. "We taught her about strangers, about not getting in cars. We even made a password, something only we would know. If anyone ever needed to pick her up and said we sent them, she was supposed to ask for the word. I wrote it down before I asked. What's the word?" His jaw flexed. "Unicorn." I don't know what I expected him to say, something mundane. Maybe, like apple or grandma. But unicorn hung there between us, too whimsical for the gravity in the room. "Why that word?" I asked. Linda managed a small, broken smile. She loves unicorns. She thinks they're pure, magic that can't be faked, God, the cruelty of it. Does anyone else know the word? McDaniel asked. Just family, Gary said. Her uncle, my brother, and Joe, I guess. He was here when we went over it. I didn't think. He swallowed. He's practically family. That was the first time I heard the name that would come to define my career. Joe. Joseph Robert Kondro. At that moment, he was just a friend of the family. Someone who'd helped them move a couch the week before. The kind of man who shows up with a six-pack and a half-smile whenever something breaks in your house. Not a monster. Not yet. I didn't know, standing in that living room, that years later I'd be staring through the glass of a prison interview room at Joe's smug, aging face as he described how easy it had been. I just said the magic word, Danny, he told me. You were the one who gave it to me. You left it lying on the table, but that's getting ahead of the story. That first night, all we had was a missing girl, a short walk from school, and 100 bad possibilities. We retraced her route from St. Helens Elementary to home, flashlights cutting pale tunnels through the dark. Volunteers joined in, neighbors, church members, kids who should have been doing homework but were instead shouting Rima's name into the night. Dogs barked, porch lights flicked on up and down the block. At the corner where the neighbor had last seen her, someone had left a paper unicorn decoration from the school fair. The wind had plastered it against a chain-link fence, the colors running where the drizzle had caught it. I pried it loose and turned it over. On the back, in careful third-grader handwriting, was a single word, unicorn. I felt something icy settle in my gut. Predators don't create vulnerabilities. They borrow them. They wait for us to build things we think will protect us, and then they study how to turn those things inside out. We canvassed every house, every parked car. By midnight, the lieutenant called it. Okay, he said grimly. This isn't a kid at a friend's house anymore. This is an abduction. The word landed heavy. Abduction. Not lost. Not late. Taken. The FBI liaison drove in from Portland before dawn. A command post went up. Phone lines lit up with tips white vans that weren't really white. Men with mustaches who turned out to be teachers or mail carriers. Sightings that evaporated under 5 minutes of questioning. We pulled Rima's school records, talked to teachers, talked to kids who had walked with her part of the way home. She had a rainbow in her hair, one little girl told me, eyes wide behind thick glasses, a barrette. She said it was her lucky one. How did she seem? I asked. Happy, the girl said. She said she wanted a unicorn cake for her birthday. Her birthday had been 6 months earlier. By the second day, the weather turned. The sky went low and gray, soaking the search parties that combed the woods near Germany Creek. I remember watching a line of volunteers disappear into the trees, bright orange vests swallowed by shadow, and thinking how small an 8-year-old really is. You don't realize it when they're laughing, when they're bouncing on your sofa. But when you picture that same little body alone in the woods, next to men with heavy boots, the scale of things changes. We found nothing. No clothing, no books, no backpack. The earth kept its secrets. The press came next, like they always do. Camera trucks lining the street, satellite dishes turned at the sky like metal flowers. Milk carton age, one reporter called it, alluding to the photographs of missing kids that had started appearing on breakfast tables across America. Linda stood in front of the cameras, clutching a framed school photo of Rima, voice shaking as she pleaded, "Please, whoever has her, just bring her home. No questions. Please." Behind her, Gary stared straight into the lens, jaw locked, like he was memorizing the face of the anonymous monster on the other side. I'd seen families fall apart under that kind of stress. Affairs coming to light, secret addictions, old resentments. With the Traxlers, it was something more quiet, a sort of shared, stunned disbelief. They had done everything right. They had read the pamphlets. They had rehearsed the safety word. And still, Their little girl was gone. 2 weeks after Rima disappeared, the leads dried up. We followed a man who'd been seen talking to kids at a park. Turns out he was a youth pastor organizing a softball team. We tracked down a rusty sedan reported near the school. Its owner was a single mother who worked nights and had no idea why we were banging on her door. We ran down every sex offender in a 50-mile radius. For every actual predator, there were 10 pathetic men who lived more in their fantasies than in reality. None of them had gone near Rima that day. And all that time, Joe hovered at the edges. He came to the house, brought casseroles, mowed their lawn when Gary went back to work. He joined one of the search lines for a day or two. He talked to Linda softly on the porch when she couldn't stop trembling. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was just a good man trying to help a broken family. The first time I noticed him was at a community vigil for Rima in the church gym. Candles, styrofoam cups of bad coffee, a slideshow of school photos projected onto a bedsheet. Rima in a Halloween costume. Rima holding a kitten. Rima on that swing in the front yard. I was standing by the wall, watching, when I saw a man in a worn denim jacket sitting near the back, head bowed. At first, I took him for another grieving neighbor. Then I noticed how his eyes weren't on the slideshow at all. They were on Linda. When the vigil ended, and everyone shuffled toward the exits in that shell-shocked, whispering way crowds have after tragedy, he moved to her like iron to a magnet. He put an arm around her shoulders, leaned in close. She sagged against him, just for a moment, like he was a tree she could rest against. "Who's that?" I asked McDaniel quietly. He followed my gaze. "That's Joe, friend of the family." "Friend?" I asked. "Grew up with her, I think," McDaniel said. "Been around since before Gary." He shrugged. "You know how these small-town histories are. Everyone's got an ex or a friend in the picture." I watched Joe hug Linda, whisper something in her ear that made her nod, eyes squeezed shut. He looked up, just for a second, and our eyes met. He smiled, small and polite, like a man acknowledging a police presence with respect. But there was something else in his gaze, too. Not fear, not grief, appraisal, like he was measuring me, the way a hunter measures distance to a tree line. I made a note to talk to him. That was all, just a note. 15 years later, sitting across from him in a prison interview room, he would laugh when I told him that. "You were close," he said. "Closer than you knew. But you didn't want to see me. Not really. You wanted a monster under the bed, not one sitting on the couch." Maybe he was right. Or maybe sometimes evil is so ordinary, you have to train yourself to notice it. The first time I heard the phrase unicorn password out loud was about a week after Rima vanished. Gary sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, an untouched cup of coffee cooling in front of him. "I just keep going over it," he said. "We drilled it. What do you do if someone says your mom sent them?" And she'd say, "Ask for the password." And we'd say, "And what is it?" And she'd say, "Unicorn," and laugh, and we'd laugh too. She thought it was a game. "It wasn't your fault," I said automatically. "It's what you say. It's in the manual." He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot. "But it is, isn't it?" If he knew it, if I said it around him, if I told him, because I thought we were all on the same side. That was when he told me, for the first time, about the day in their living room when they'd gone over the safety rules, and Joe had been there, beer in hand, nodding along, pretending to be impressed. "Smart," Joe had said. "Real smart. Unicorn. Kids'll remember that." I wrote it down in my report, like I was supposed to. But it would be years before those words turned into a confession, before Joe would lean back in his prison chair and say, "She trusted me. You gave me the key, and I used it." If this were just a true crime story, maybe that would be the end of it. A cautionary tale about misplaced trust and a clever predator. But what happened around the unicorn password isn't that simple. There are things that happened in this case that do not fit neatly into police reports or court documents. Lights in the woods that appeared where no flashlights were. Dreams that more than one person had about the same tree, the same creek. A series of coincidences so precise they stopped feeling like coincidence at all. I'm a cop, not a mystic. I know how pareidolia works, how people see patterns in noise, how desperate minds stitch meaning into chaos. But I also know what I saw on a cold March morning years later, standing by Germany Creek with a search team, when something in the air shifted and every bird in the trees went silent at once. You don't have to believe me. You just have to listen. Because the story of the unicorn password isn't only about how a word failed one little girl. It's also about how, in the end, something we can't quite name refused to let her be entirely forgotten. And that part of the story starts, for me, on the night I first heard her voice. Not in a seance, not in a dream. On a police tape labeled, in my own handwriting, Traxler Rima Interview. By procedure, we didn't interview 8-year-olds alone, not in 1985 and not anywhere with decent policies, especially not after they vanished. We interviewed their parents, their teachers, their classmates, people who could sign forms and spell their own names, people whose memories would hold steady under the weight of cross-examination. But 1 month after Rima disappeared, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, reached past a stack of old case files, and my fingers bumped against a cassette I didn't remember putting there. I picked it up, frowning. It was a standard, cheap, black plastic tape, the kind we used for witness interviews. On its label, in blue ballpoint pen, were 3 words in my own handwriting. Traxler, Rima Interview. For a long moment, I just stared at it. The squad room around me buzzed with the usual noises. Phones ringing, someone cursing at the copy machine, the distant bark of a dispatcher's voice. Ordinary chaos. The kind of sound that washed over you until it became background. But in my little bubble, there was only the tape and my heartbeat. I knew every interview I'd done on the Traxler case. Knew them by heart. McDaniel and I had never sat down with Rima, not formally. We'd seen photos, heard stories, talked to everyone who'd ever walked her home. But Rima herself had been missing from the very beginning. That was the whole point of a missing child case. So why did I have a tape that said otherwise? "Hey, Hart, you look like you saw a ghost," McDaniel said, dropping a file onto my desk. "Maybe I did," I murmured. He followed my gaze, saw the tape, and snorted. "Probably a mislabel. You're not exactly a calligrapher." "Thing is," I said slowly, "I don't remember labeling it at all." He raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's your handwriting?" I turned the tape, squinting. The capital T in Traxler had that same weird little hook I'd had since high school. The R leaned too far back, like it was tired. It was mine. No question. "Yeah," I said. "It's mine." "Well, only one way to find out what's on it." He reached for it. "Got an old player around here somewhere?" I hesitated, then handed it over. As he walked to the dusty tape deck on the evidence shelf, a chill crawled up the back of my neck, the same sensation you get when you're certain someone's watching you, but you can't see from where. He popped the cassette in, hit play. For a second, there was only hiss, that comforting analog static. Then a click, and the sound of a chair scraping on linoleum. "State your name for the record, please," a man's voice said. My voice, younger but unmistakable. "Rima Danette Traxler," a small, clear voice answered. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. McDaniel turned slowly, eyes wide. "What the hell?" he whispered. The sounds on the tape continued, smooth and ordinary, as if they had always existed. "Can you tell me how old you are, Rima?" My recorded self asked. "I'm 8, she said, "but I turned 9 in November." "Mom says I'm growing too fast." There was a rustle of paper, the clink of a pen against a coffee mug. "Do you know why you're here today?" I asked on the tape. Rima hesitated, then giggled soft, unsure. 'Cause I did something wrong? No, my recorded voice said, gentle. You're not in trouble. I just want to talk to you a little bit. Is that okay? Okay, she said. I realized I was holding my breath. Across the room, a few of the other detectives had gone still, listening. Someone muted the police scanner. McDaniel reached for the stop button, but I held up a hand. Let it play, I said. He did. As it ran, something in me split into two. One part was the rational cop, searching for the explanation: misfiled tape, wrong date, maybe some other case with a girl whose name sounded similar. The other part, the one that lived closer to the bone, sat very still and listened to the tone of the child's voice, the cadence, the way she said her own name. It was her. I had heard that name from her mother's lips so many times I could have recognized it in a crowd of 100 kids. But hearing it from Rima, herself alive, solid, a little shy, felt like someone had opened a door to a room I'd boarded up years ago. What's your favorite animal, Rima? My tape self asked. Unicorns, she said immediately, with the certainty only children and fanatics have. 'Cause they're special. They only come to good people. Someone in the room swore under his breath. Do you have a password, Rima? My voice went on. A special word you use with your mom and dad? Yeah, she said. Mom says I'm not supposed to tell anybody, though. That's very smart, I said. There was a smile in my voice. You don't have to say it here. I just want to know you remember it. Course I remember it, she said. It's my unicorn word. Your unicorn word, I repeated. And what does it do? It keeps me safe, she said softly. If someone bad says they know my mom, they won't know the word. Then I'll know not to go. On the tape, there was a moment of silence. I could almost see my younger self, pen hovering over his notebook, looking at this small girl across a heavy wooden table and thinking, this is what childhood should be. Rules that work, monsters that stay on the other side of the line. Do you ever feel unsafe walking home from school? I asked. Sometimes there's a car, she said. A blue car. It goes slow. My heart kicked. What kind of blue? I asked on the recording. Like dark ocean, she said. My friend Cassie says it's ugly. Does the car stop? I asked. Sometimes it stops at the sign, she said. Sometimes it stops when there's no other cars, too. But that's 'cause there's a hill, and Mom says you're supposed to go slow on hills. Have you ever seen who's driving? I asked. Another pause. On the tape, a chair creaked. Sometimes, she said. What does he look like? He smiles too much, she said. In the squad room, a stapler dropped to the floor. No one picked it up. I felt like the air had thickened, like we were all breathing through syrup. Too much? I prompted on the tape. Yeah, she said. Like when grown-ups smile, but their eyes don't. Mom says that's rude to say, but she doesn't like him either when he's like that. Do you know his name? I asked. Joe, she said. He was at my house. He knows the word. The room went dead quiet. On the tape, there was the faint sound of my pen scratching. He knows the password? I repeated, voice too steady, too flat. Yeah, she said, 'cause Daddy told him. When we played the game, he said, tell Joe so he can help keep you safe. She huffed. I told Daddy unicorns don't need helpers. No one laughed. Not now. Not with what we all knew had happened next. The tape continued for another 20 minutes, childish detours about school lunches and playground politics, my voice weaving in and out, gently steering her back to the car, to the man named Joe, to the places she walked every day. It ended with a small, polite bye and the scrape of a chair. Then the click of the stop button. The whir of a tape rewinding. Silence. McDaniel finally exhaled. You ever going to tell us when you did that interview? Or are we supposed to guess? I didn't, I said. He stared at me like I just said I'd sprouted wings. You're on the tape, Hart. I know. But I never sat across from her like that. Not once. You're saying this is faked? Somebody did a real good impression of you. I'm saying I don't remember ever meeting her before she vanished, I said. And I would remember. You don't forget kids like that. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Picked up the tape, turned it over, studied the label. Maybe it was before she went missing, he said. Some other case. Maybe her name came up, and you took a brief statement. Something minor. Truancy, maybe, or a custody thing. You forgot about it, then filed it in the wrong place. Possible, I said. But why would I label it with her full name and interview, like it was a main file? And why, I added quietly, would I ask an 8-year-old to tell me about a man named Joe who knows her safety word, if I didn't think she was already in danger? We both looked at the tape again. Look at the date stamp, he said. Old departments leave their marks in funny ways. In our case, the secretaries had a habit of writing the date in microscopic numbers on the back of any media that passed their desks. I flipped the cassette over, squinted. The 10th of April, 85, I read aloud. A month before she disappeared, McDaniel said. For a cop, there are moments when the world narrows to a single point. A gun barrel, a knife glinting in the dark, a child's shoe in the mud, or a date inked tiny on the back of a tape that shouldn't exist. I felt the floor tilt under me just a fraction. On that date, April 10th, 1985, I had been working a burglary string on the other side of town. I remembered the case. Remembered the guy we eventually caught, a jittery 20-something who'd broken into 3 houses looking for cash to buy meth. I could picture his face, but I had no memory of sitting in an interview room with Rima Traxler. Let's check the logs, I said. We tore through them. Sign-in sheets, room reservations, evidence intake. On April 10th, I'd signed out interview room B from 2 o'clock to 3:30 p.m. The subject line was a simple, frustrating word. Juvenile. Could have been anybody, McDaniel said. Teacher bringing in a kid who vandalized something. Parents wanting to scare their son straight. Could have been, I said. Except we now have a tape with my voice, talking to a girl who goes missing exactly a month later, asking her about a man who turns out to be a serial predator. And it sat in my drawer for a month before I found it. I didn't add the last part, and I only found it because my hand accidentally brushed it at the exact moment I was thinking about closing the file. Sometimes the line between chance and message blurs. We made copies of the tape, sent one to the prosecutor's office, one to evidence, kept one on my desk. For a while, I tried to file it under coincidence and move on. I told myself memory is fallible, that early career interviews blur together, that I had simply forgotten. The human brain edits its own history all the time. Any shrink will tell you that. But at night, when the house was quiet and the TV glow flickered uselessly across my living room, I'd hear her voice in my head. He smiles too much. He knows the word. Unicorns don't need helpers. There are kids whose voices never leave you. Rima joined their chorus. You might be wondering why, if we had that tape, the case still took years to solve. Why a man who'd been in their living room, who knew the password, who smiled too much, didn't end up in handcuffs within weeks. The short answer is, evil is rarely stupid. The long answer involves another girl, another disappearance, and a Volkswagen up on blocks near Germany Creek. When Kara Rudd went missing in November of 1996, I was no longer the new guy. I'd seen my share of violence, of bodies pulled from rivers, of parents collapsing in hallways. I'd also seen enough false alarms to know that not every missing 12-year-old is a homicide. By then, I'd built a kind of hard shell over the part of me that had once taken every case home like a stray dog. But when Kara's name came over the radio, something in me flinched. Where? I asked the dispatcher. Monticello Middle School, she said. Last seen getting into a car. A car. A school. A girl who didn't come home. I found myself thinking, not of protocols and search perimeters, but of a tape in my desk drawer and a little voice saying, "He smiles too much." We worked Kara's case hard. The community remembered Rima. Longview is not a place that forgets its ghosts. Every missing child since 1985 lived under Rima's shadow, whether they knew her name or not. It didn't take long for Joe to surface again. He had a way of orbiting troubled spaces. He was a friend of Kara's mother, had crashed in their garage when times were lean. He was Uncle Joe to the kids, the kind of adult who let them do things their parents wouldn't. Stay up late, watch horror movies, drink a sip of beer at a barbecue. Boundaries were suggestions to him, not rules. By then, I'd done my homework. I'd gone back over every line of the Traxler file with Joe in mind. His traffic tickets, his bar fights, the way he always seemed to be there, hovering, when a local girl went missing or hurt. Men like him don't appear suddenly. They accrete layer by layer, hiding behind charm and half-truths. When Kara vanished, Joe claimed he'd been nowhere near the school, but witnesses put his car in the area. Fibers and fluid on the body we eventually found under that abandoned Volkswagen put him at the scene of her murder beyond any reasonable doubt. Still, even as we built the case, even as we boxed him in, something in me kept circling back to that tape. If the date was real, if the interview had happened a month before Rima disappeared, then I had missed my chance to save her. I had sat across from her, heard her talk about the man who knew her password, and failed to see the shape of the danger. You can thrash against that kind of guilt, or you can try to make it mean something. I chose the second option. I started thinking of the tape not as a taunt, but as a second chance. When Joe finally agreed to talk, not the smug stonewalling he'd given us during Kara's investigation, it was because he wanted a deal. Death penalty off the table, life instead of lethal injection. He thought he was clever, offering us closure on old cases in exchange for breathing. We gathered in that stale interview room, me, the prosecutor, a tape recorder that whirred more quietly than the one from 1985. Joe shuffled in, hands cuffed, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look like a sickly pumpkin. He smiled when he saw me. "Danny," he said. "Been a long time. It's Detective Hart," I said. He shrugged, sat, chains clinking. "We're old friends. Don't be so formal." He looked older, but not by much. Some men wear guilt. It etches itself into their faces. Joe wore nothing. If anything, he seemed lighter than he had the year before, as if confessing to one murder had taken weight off his shoulders instead of adding it. The prosecutor laid out the terms. Joe would talk about other cases, other girls, in exchange for a specific sentencing recommendation. No promises beyond that. No guarantees. Joe considered, then nodded. "I'll tell you about Rima," he said, looking straight at me. My throat went dry. He shouldn't have known how much that name still held power over me. Predators shouldn't be that perceptive, but they are. That's how they find their way to unicorn passwords in the first place. "I don't want stories," I said. "I want the truth. Names, dates, locations. Where she is. That's the problem, Danny," he said, almost wistful. "I don't know where she is anymore." He started talking. And as he described that May afternoon in 1985, bits of it lined up too perfectly with what Rima had said on the tape for me to chalk the recording up to a glitch. "Your boy there," he said, jerking his chin at the prosecutor, "thinks you're the one who nailed me. But really, you're the one who handed her to me. How's that?" I asked, my hand steady on the table, my nails digging crescents into my palm under it. "You remember that night in their living room?" he said. "When you went over the safety rules, the password? I was right there. You didn't even look at me. You were so focused on the parents, on the kid. Cops never look at the guy on the couch. Every word hit like a hammer. In his version, I had been there. Not just on a tape, but in a room I had somehow refused to remember. He described Rima's rainbow beret, her pink shirt, the way she'd looked at him, wary but obedient, when he'd said the word at the curb, unicorn. The air had smelled like wet pavement and clover, he said. She'd hesitated for less than a second, then climbed into his car, because, of course, the password meant safety. When he got to the creek, to what he did to her there, I shut it down. I didn't need those images in my head. The facts were enough. He'd killed her, buried her near Germany Creek. Years of rain and animals had done the rest. You'll never find her now, he said with a little shrug. She's part of the woods. The unicorn went home. I wanted to hit him. Instead, I slid a manila envelope across the table. Then explain this, I said. Inside was a still image from the tape. We'd transferred part of it to a grainy video format as an experiment, enhancing the audio waveform as a line of light. In the frame, that light flickered into a strange, pulsing pattern during one particular phrase. He knows the word. You've been talking to psychics now, Danny? Joe smirked. Bit late for that. No, I said. Just to experts in anomalies. He laughed, but there was a tightness to it. For the first time, a hint of uncertainty. Do you believe in ghosts, Joe? I asked. I believe in what I can touch, he said. That's funny, I said quietly, because it feels a whole lot like something has been trying to talk for a long time. Through tapes that shouldn't exist. Through dreams people keep having about the same place. Through patterns too precise to be random. He sneered. You're just trying to make this mean something. There's no grand plan, Danny. There's just men like me and men like you who can't stop us in time. Maybe he was right. Maybe the tape was a clerical error, and my brain was stitching supernatural meaning onto ordinary tragedy. But even now, years into retirement, every time I wake up from dreaming of a girl with a rainbow beret standing by a creek that no longer runs where the map says it should, I remember the way the tape appeared exactly when I was about to box up her file for good. It's easy to say everything strange is coincidence when you're not standing in the crosshairs of it. In the months after Joe's confession, as the court ground its way toward sentencing, the official story of the unicorn password solidified. Reporters wrote their pieces. True crime shows pitched their reenactments. A safety rule turned deadly, they said. A word meant to protect a child became the key to her abduction. It's a good headline. Clean. Irony sells. But in the quiet corners, where people who really lived with these cases gather, there were always more questions. About the tape. About the way Rima's brother claimed to see her in the hallway some nights, years after she'd gone. About the way Linda swore she heard a little voice say, "Don't go with him," the week before Rima vanished, while she was doing dishes and listening to the radio. Grief makes people see things, the skeptics say maybe. Or maybe some children refuse to leave quietly. If you're waiting for the part where we find her bones neatly laid out under a tree, with a unicorn toy beside them, you're going to be disappointed. This isn't that kind of story. Rima's body has never been found. The woods around Germany Creek have been searched more times than some police academies train cadets. They turned up animal remains, old bottles, rusted tools. No Rima. And yet there is something out there. Ask any hunter who's gotten turned around near the old swimming hole on a foggy morning, only to hear a child's laughter in the trees and follow it back onto the trail. Ask the search and rescue volunteer who swears her GPS glitched only when she walked past a certain moss-covered stump, rerouting her toward the road just before the storm hit. They'll tell you, if you get a few beers in them and promise not to print their names, that the place feels watched, not with malice, with a sort of fierce, small vigilance, like a sentry standing guard over something no longer there. When I retired, the department boxed up my old cases. Some went to archives. Some stayed active, Thin files waiting for DNA miracles. Rima's case was officially closed in terms of perpetrator identity. The state believes Joe's confession. But there's a sticky note on the inside cover that I put there myself. Location: unresolved. You can close a folder. You can lock a man in a cage. That doesn't mean the story is over. Sometimes, late at night, I take the copy of the tape I wasn't supposed to keep, slide it into an aging player, and listen. Unicorns don't need helpers, she says. Maybe not, I answer now, in the dark of my living room. But sometimes they get one anyway. Because whether you believe in ghosts or not, whether you think the tape was a glitch in time or just a memory I buried to protect myself, there is one truth I can't shake. Something kept that cassette from disappearing into the evidence room abyss. Something made my hand close around it the day I was finally ready to give up. Hook, heighten, hold. Those are the rules of good storytelling. But sometimes it feels like the story has rules of its own. If the story ended with a tape and a confession, it would still be ugly, but at least it would be tidy. People like tidy. They like to know where to put their fear. On a map, on a man, in a courtroom file. They don't want it slipping under doors or humming in the walls. The first time I felt the case slipping out of those neat boxes was on a Sunday morning in late autumn, not long after Joe's sentencing. I was in church. You might not expect that from a cop, at least not one who spent as many years as I have stepping over bodies. But Longview is the kind of town where Sunday still has a particular weight. Stores open late, roads are quiet. People sit on wooden pews and try to believe that someone is listening. I didn't go every week. When I did, I sat near the back, where I could see the exits. Habit, professional paranoia, masquerading as piety. That morning, the sermon washed over me without sticking something about forgiveness, about letting go of burdens. The kind of message that always felt like it was aimed one row in front of me. Halfway through, a girl with a rainbow beret walked past the open church doors. At least, that's what my mind told me in the split second before my body was on its feet. The pastor's voice blurred into a background drone as I stepped into the aisle, earning a few annoyed glances. Sunlight knifed in from the parking lot, right after the dim interior. For a heartbeat, I was back in 1985, running out of a briefing thinking, if we just move faster. Outside, the lot was full of minivans and sedans. A couple of kids chased each other between bumpers. A woman adjusted a baby in a car seat. No rainbow beret, no pink shirt. Just ordinary life, humming along like it always does after something terrible has happened to someone else. I stood there, feeling foolish, until a small voice behind me said, "Mister, are you okay?" I turned. A girl of about 10 stood there, her hand in her mother's. Brown hair. No beret. Different face, different era. But something about the tilt of her head, the creased concern between her eyebrows, hit me in a place I'd tried to board up. I'm fine. I lied. Just thought I saw someone I knew. Her mother gave me a polite, wary smile, the look people reserve for cops and door-to-door proselytizers. "Come on, Ellie," she murmured, tugging her daughter toward their car. Ellie, not Rima. Different child, different story. I watched them go until they were just another vehicle merging onto the road. When I went back inside, the pastor was telling a story about a lost sheep. He gestured broadly, voice warm, the way men do when they're sure they're hitting all the right notes. I slid into my pew, heart still pounding. Sometimes, he said, the shepherd leaves the 99 to find the one that's gone astray. I stared at the cross on the wall and thought, what if the one never wanted to be found? That afternoon, I drove to Germany Creek. Officially, there was no reason to. The searches were long over. The case was resolved. The state had its monster in a cage. But the sticky note inside Rima's file, the one that said, location unresolved. Might as well have been stuck to my dashboard. The road out to the creek is one of those northwest stretches that feels like it's always on the edge of rain. Moss creeps up the trunks of maples and firs. Ferns crowd the ditches. Even in summer, the air smells like wet earth and something older, something that's been watching people come and go for a very long time. I pulled over near the old turnout we'd used during the searches. The wooden nitrogen monoxide dumping sign leaned at an angle, graffiti scrawled across it. Someone had drawn a crude unicorn in black marker, horn crooked, eyes X'd out. I stared at it for a long moment, then told myself not to be dramatic. Kids draw things. Not everything is a sign. The trail into the trees was narrow but familiar. My boots found old rhythms as I walked, skirting muddy patches, stepping over fallen branches. Jocelyn, one of the K9 handlers, used to say the land remembers being searched. It settles differently afterward, like a bed someone's rolled out of. I don't know if that's true, but Germany Creek felt aware. Half a mile in, the sound of water reached me a low murmur over stones. The creek itself had shifted since the 80s. Erosion carving new curves, banks crumbling in old storms. Places that had once been undercut were now open. Places that had been clear were choked with brambles. I stood on a small rise and looked down. This was where we'd focused so much of our effort after Joe's confession. He'd given us a description so maddeningly generic, by a fallen log near a bend in the creek, where you can see the road if you squint, that it could have matched a dozen spots. We'd used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, volunteers with metal probes. Nothing. Now, in the thin autumn light, the place looked almost peaceful. Leaves floated in eddies. A jay screeched somewhere overhead, offended by my presence. I closed my eyes and listened. "Okay," I said quietly, feeling ridiculous and doing it anyway. "If you're going to keep tugging at my sleeve from 30 years away, the least you can do is tell me where to stand." The wind shifted. Somewhere behind me, a branch cracked. I turned, hand instinctively going for the gun I no longer wore. Old habits. Nothing moved except a squirrel launching itself from one trunk to another, tail flicking. And then I heard it. Not words, not a full-formed voice, just a sound. A giggle. Soft, breathless. The kind of stifled laugh a child makes when they're trying not to be caught hiding behind a curtain. I spun, scanning the trees. "Hello?" I called. "Anyone out here?" Silence, except for the creek. Logic lined up its arguments. Sound carries strangely in the woods. Water and wind can mimic things. Memory can misfire, grafting old audio onto new settings. But logic wasn't the part of me that found my feet moving of their own accord, carrying me down the slope to the edge of the creek. There, half covered in moss, was a stump I'd walked past a dozen times. An ordinary thing. Rotting wood, bracket fungi, ants going about their tiny lives. But someone recently, by the look of it, had carved something into the exposed side. Not initials. Not the usual crude anatomy teenage boys leave behind. One word, in shaky, uneven letters. Unicorn. The carving was fresh enough that the wood beneath was still pale. No way it had been there during the original searches. I reached out and brushed my fingertips over the letters. The groove was rough, the way it gets when someone uses a pocket knife in a hurry. At the bottom of the U, almost too shallow to see, was the faint outline of another letter someone had started, then abandoned. An R. I stepped back, heart thudding. "Kids come out here," I muttered to myself. "They've heard the stories. They carve the spooky word into a stump and scare each other. That's it. The problem with being a detective is that you spend your whole life asking what else, what if, what next. That instinct doesn't turn off just because you want it to. What else? The stump was in a spot that hadn't been part of the original grid search. Back then, the brush had been too thick. A line had been drawn on a map, resources allocated, decisions made. We'd bet on one side of the creek. Maybe we'd bet wrong. What if the kid who carved the word, if it was a kid at all, had felt drawn here without fully knowing why? What next? I could walk away, tell myself it was pareidolia and campfire lore. Or I could do the thing I'd done my whole life. I chose the latter. By Monday morning, I was back in the building I'd supposedly left behind, leaning on old favors. "You're retired, Hart," my former lieutenant said, rubbing his temples. "You don't get to just walk in here, point at a map, and say, 'Send me a crew.'" "I'm not asking for a crew," I said. "Just a dog and a handler. On their off day, if you have to. I'll buy lunch. I'll carry the damn gear." He sighed. "You know how many wild goose chases we get off guys who can't let go of their pet cases?" "I'm not talking about a pet case," I said. "I'm talking about an 8-year-old who never came home. We closed the book on who took her, not on where she is." He stared at me for a long moment. "You find something out there, it goes through proper channels," he said finally. "No hero stunts." "I'm too old for hero stunts," I said. "My knees won't cooperate," he snorted despite himself. "Fine. I'll see who's willing to humor a relic." That was how I ended up back at Germany Creek, 2 days later, rain seeping into my collar, watching a German shepherd named Cairo lower his nose to the ground near the stump. His handler, Jocelyn, the same one from the old searches, now gone silver at the temples, gave me a sideways look. "Feels like déjà vu," she said. "You sure this is a good idea, Hart?" "Ghost hunting with a K9 unit isn't in my job description. You always said your dog was smarter than half the guys on the force," I said. "Let's see if that's still true." Cairo snorted as if he'd heard me, then tugged on his lead, circling the stump. His ears pricked forward, body going taut. Jocelyn frowned. "He's got something." "What kind of something?" I asked. "Could be old," she said. "Could be nothing. But he's interested." We followed him as he pulled us a few yards downstream, then abruptly cut right, scrambling up a small incline. The ground there was uneven, scarred by old erosion. Roots jutted like knuckles through the dirt. Cairo stopped beside a particular tangle of roots and began to paw. Jocelyn knelt, hand firm on his collar. "Easy, boy. Easy." The smell hit before the sight did. Not the fresh rot of a recent kill, but that deep, sweet, sour undertone that clings to places where something once decayed and long since moved on. It's like smoke in curtains you can scrub, repaint, pretend, but some part of it lingers. "There's nothing here," I said, even as my stomach flipped. "We've been over this ground." "Not this exact spot," she murmured, eyes scanning the slope. "The grid line stopped down there, remember? Too thick up here. We didn't have the manpower." "You remember a grid line from 30 years ago?" I asked, half impressed, half skeptical. She shrugged. "Dogs remember landscapes. Handlers remember their dogs." Cairo whined softly, then lowered himself, belly close to the ground, nose pressed to the damp earth. That posture wasn't excitement. It was something like reverence. Jocelyn met my eyes. "I'm not saying she's here. Whatever was here has been gone a long time. But he's telling us this place holds a story." The rational part of my brain kicked in. "So do half the woods in this county. Hunters, campers, dead deer, you name it." "Sure," she said. "But you didn't drag me out to every dead deer spot, did you?" We marked the location, logged the GPS coordinates, took photos. On paper, it was all above board, just another entry in a long file. Off paper, it felt like stepping over an invisible threshold. That night, I dreamed of the stump. Only it wasn't rotting, not yet. The bark was intact. The word hadn't been carved. Sunlight dappled the ground around it through leaves that no longer existed. Rima stood with her back to me, hair up in a ponytail, rainbow barrette catching the light. "Rima," I called. She turned, but her face was. Not blurred, exactly. More like it refused to come fully into focus, as if my mind knew that seeing it clearly would be too much. Unicorns don't need helpers, she said. I know, I said. But I'm here anyway. She pointed toward the creek. I followed her gesture, but when I looked back, she was gone. In her place, carved into the bark of the living tree, was a single word in my own handwriting. Listen. I woke up with my heart pounding and the echo of water in my ears. You can dismiss dreams. God knows I've dismissed plenty. The subconscious is a hoarder. It drags out old scraps when you're not looking. But as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the note I'd scribbled half, asleep, listen, stump, dog, smell, I couldn't shake the feeling that the case was shifting again, like a sleeper rolling over. Unexplained phenomena, one of the TV show producers had called it. In a pitch email years after the case ended, we want to explore the spiritual side of cold cases. Ghosts of the missing helping solve their own murders. That kind of thing? I deleted the email. It felt exploitative. Turn a family's grief into a spooky episode about EVP and night vision cameras. No, I wondered if I'd been too quick to scoff. I didn't tell anyone about the dream. You don't keep your credibility in this line of work by talking about teenage girls showing up in your sleep to point at trees. What I did instead was what I've always done. I went back to the evidence. The tape, the date stamp, the interview logs. I spread them out on my dining table, the way I had countless times before. Only this time, I brought a topographic map of the Germany Creek area into the mix too. Cairo's GPS ping, old search grids, new erosion patterns. Piece by piece, something emerged, a shape not unlike a unicorn if you squinted. A route from the road to the water that bypassed the areas we'd focused on. A cluster of odd incidents near that same bend. Hikers getting turned around, compasses briefly spinning, radios crackling to static. Little things, dismissible things. But they clustered, the way witnesses' stories do when you're circling closer to the truth. Don't ignore the weird. He'd sat around a cigarette. Most guys leap for the clean story, the one that fits the training manual. But it's the weird details, things that don't fit, that tell you where the seams are. The seams of what? I'd asked. Reality, he'd said with a grin. Or at least the version of it we get to see on the clock. At 24, I'd chalked it up to nicotine and too many night shifts. At 60 plus, with a tape that shouldn't exist and a dog that lay down on clean earth like it was a grave, I was less sure. Maybe the world has seams. Maybe some cases tug at them harder than others. I went back out to the creek one more time before the heavy winter rain set in. Alone this time, no dogs. No official sanction. Just me, the trees, and whatever else was listening. The stump was the same as before, moss covered, the word unicorn rough in its side. I sat on a nearby rock, joints protesting, and let the sounds of the place wash over me. Water, wind, the creak of branches. I don't know what you want from me, I said quietly. You're gone. He's locked up. The world moved on. What's left? For a while, there was nothing. Then, as if in answer, a faint melody drifted on the air. Not words, not even a full song. Just a fragment of child's humming, simple and tuneless, the kind of noise kids make when they color or tie their shoes. I turned my head, scanning. Rima? The humming cut off. A crow cawed in the distance, harsh, almost mocking. I laughed once, humorless. This is ridiculous, I muttered, talking to stumps, hearing things that aren't there. But when I stood to go, my foot kicked something half buried in the leaf litter. It skittered a few inches and caught the light. I bent down, heart in my throat. It was a small plastic bead, faded white, with the ghost of a pink letter on it. These things had been everywhere in the 80s friendship bracelets, name necklaces, little strings of identity hanging from kids' wrists. I rubbed it between my fingers, scraping away dirt until the letter showed clearer. Of course it was. I stood there, holding that tiny relic of some child's life, maybe Rima's, maybe some other girls who'd played near the creek long after 1985 and felt the scene tug again. Some stories don't want to be shut. Some passwords never fully fail. If you work long enough around grief, you start to recognize its shapes. There's the sharp, frantic kind that claws at you in the first days after a loss, all questions and bargains, and if-onlys. Then there's the slow, sedimentary kind that settles over years, turning bright memory into something like stone. Rima's case had both, layered so thick that most people in Longview had stopped trying to dig through it. They folded her into local folklore, a cautionary tale, a milk carton ghost, a name that made parents squeeze their kids' hands a little tighter near school gates and went on with their lives. But for some of us, the sediment never fully set. Every new bead, every carved word in a stump, every dog that lay down on clean earth like it was consecrated ground kept the surface just soft enough to press a thumb into. The bead sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I told anyone about it. Not because it was necessarily significant God knows a single plastic letter doesn't make a case, but because of what it represented. Evidence is supposed to live in labeled bags in controlled rooms, not next to a coffee mug and a bottle of blood pressure pills. On the third night, after pushing it around the table with one finger while the 6 o'clock news droned on about politics, I picked up the phone and called Rima Traxler. We hadn't spoken in years without a third party present. After Joe's confession, the relationship between the department and the family had shifted into something brittle. They were grateful, in the way survivors are grateful to surgeons who can't undo the original injury. But gratitude and trust are not the same thing. Every so often, a new detective would be assigned as liaison and would dutifully check in, re-explain why no remains had been found, reassure them that the case was still important to us, even as new tragedies demanded fresher resources. I'd stepped back when I retired, thinking maybe my absence would help them move on. Hello? Her voice on the line was thinner than I remembered, threaded with age and cigarettes. Linda, it's Daniel Hart. A pause. Detective Hart. A small stress on the title, like she wasn't quite sure if she was allowed to strip it away, even now. Just Daniel is fine, I said. How are you holding up? She made a dry sound that might have been a laugh. Depends on the day. Some mornings I remember to put my keys in the freezer and the ice tray in my purse. Some mornings I get it right. We talked around the thing for a minute or two. Her son, now middle-aged with kids of his own. Gary, long gone after the divorce, a casualty of that slow, sedimentary grief. Then I told her about the creek, about Cairo, about the stump, about the bead. I know it doesn't change anything, I said. Not in the big ways. But if there's even a chance that something of hers is still out there, I thought you should hear it from me. On the other end, silence stretched. I could hear the faint clatter of dishes, the far-off murmur of a television. When she was little, Linda said finally, I used to braid those beads into her hair. You remember those? Little plastic letters on string. She'd spell her name, then change her mind and spell unicorn instead. Said that was her real name, anyway. I remember, I said softly. I didn't, not exactly not the beating, not the specific conversations, but I remembered the way parents talked about their kids, the small domestic details that became altars after a loss. She lost the R once, Linda went on. Cried for an hour. I told her we'd get a new one, but she acted like I'd suggested replacing the dog. A breath that wasn't quite steady. You think it could be? I think it could be from any girl who played near that creek in the last 40 years, I said, because honesty and cruelty sometimes share a border. But I also think places hold on to the people who pass through them. And for what it's worth, the dog reacted like he'd walked into a memory. "You and your dogs," she murmured. Another pause. "Do you still have that tape? The one you told us about, where she talks to you?" I looked toward the shelf where the cassette sat, its plastic case cloudy with age. "I do," I said. "I shouldn't. Department policy says." "Policy can go to hell," she said, sudden steel in her tone. "Does she sound happy?" The question threw me for a second. Not, "Does she sound scared?" Not, "Does she say anything that could help?" Just that. "She sounds like an 8-year-old who thinks the adults in the room can fix anything," I said. "She talks about unicorns and birthday cake and how some men smile too much." Linda let out a long breath that shuddered at the end. "Sometimes," she said, "I dream about her at that age. Same ponytail, same missing front tooth, but she doesn't talk, just looks at me, like she's waiting for me to say the right thing, and I never do." "Do you want to hear the tape?" I asked. The offer felt dangerous, like handing a lit match to someone holding a box of fireworks. There was a rustle on her end, like she was shifting in her chair. "No," she said at last. "If I hear her voice, I'll never be able to unhear it. I'll start comparing it to every memory I have, wondering which parts I made up to survive." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, connected by a line humming with things unsaid. "Do you believe in that stuff, Daniel?" she asked. "You know, signs, messages, kids coming back to nudge things." If you'd asked me that in my 20s, I'd have given you a clean answer. In my 50s, after holding too many mothers' hands, the answer had already started to fray. In my 60s, with the bead in my pocket and the word unicorn carved into wood that should have been irrelevant, the answer was Messier still. "I believe grief looks for patterns," I said slowly. "I believe sometimes those patterns are just our minds trying to make sense of chaos. And I believe sometimes the world lets us see a thread we weren't meant to miss." "That sounds like a yes and a no," she said. "That's because it is," I admitted. She surprised me then. "If she's trying to tell you something," Linda said, "you should listen. You always were too stubborn when you thought a case was done. Maybe that's why she picked me? For the tape," she said simply. "For whatever this is now. I don't know how it works, Daniel. I just know my little girl loved stories about magic that only good people could see. Maybe you're not as cynical as you pretend." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time with the receiver still in my hand, the dial tone a thin whine in my ear. "Picked you." It was an unnerving thought, not because it suggested some grand cosmic plan God knows this world doesn't offer those often, but because it implied responsibility. You can retire from a job. It's harder to retire from the person a dead child thinks you are. The bead went into an evidence bag the next day. Officially logged, unofficially flagged. I made sure a copy of the paperwork went into Rima's file, behind my old sticky note. If anyone ever reopened the ground near that stump in a more serious way, if some future technology promised more than our shovels and dogs ever could, I wanted them to have a trail to follow. But the strangest development didn't come from the woods or the lab. It came from a podcast. You have to understand, for most of my career, media meant the local paper and whatever camera crew could drive out from Portland on short notice. By the time I retired, the landscape had shifted. Every case with a twist had a documentary, a streaming special, a Reddit board full of armchair detectives picking over details like vultures. Rima's story was no exception. I'd stayed away from most of it. Watching strangers turn her life into content made something in me clench. Then one evening, my nephew, tech savvy, chronically online, sent me a link. "Uncle Dan, they're talking about you," his text read. "Cold Case Files podcast. Episode about the unicorn password. You heard it?" I almost deleted it on principle. Instead, curiosity won by a hair. The episode was slickly produced somber piano, a solemn narrator, interviews cut for maximum tension. They got a lot right, to their credit. Joe's pattern of inserting himself into families, the way he cultivated trust, the timeline of the disappearances. They even mentioned the password, framing it as a tragic example of safety measures gone wrong. But halfway through, the host's tone shifted. There is, she intoned, another layer to this story, one that verges into the unexplained. Retired Detective Daniel Hart, who worked Rima's case from the beginning, has spoken off the record about an anomalous interview tape dated a month before her disappearance. Tape in which Rima mentions a man named Joe and a secret password only her family should have known. The tape's origin remains a mystery. My grip on the phone tightened. I hadn't spoken off the record about the tape to anyone in the media. I'd mentioned it once, carefully, at a training conference, as an example of the kind of thing that can haunt an investigator. I'd never given dates, never named names. Some theorize, the host continued, that the tape is evidence of a time slip, or a residual haunting, an imprint of Rima's last days bleeding backward into the past to warn the very man who could have saved her. Others suggest a more mundane explanation, a misstated recording, a fallible memory. Detective Hart himself remains publicly non-committal. But what happened next, she said, voice dropping, is harder to explain. The episode cut to a new voice female, older, with the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years at a smoking desk. "This is Jocelyn Marks," the host said, a retired K-9 handler who worked with search dogs in the Germany Creek area. I snapped upright. "Jocelyn? On a podcast?" "She called us after one of our early episodes on the case," the host went on, with a story she had never put in an official report. The sound shifted to what was clearly a phone interview. "I don't know what you want me to say," Jocelyn's recorded voice grumbled. "Dogs react to all sorts of things. But that day by the stump, there was nothing there. No remains. No fresh scent. And Cairo lay down like he'd found a grave. Do you believe in spirits, Jocelyn?" The host asked, oozing that particular mix of curiosity and performative open-mindedness. "I believe dogs know more than we do," she replied. Whatever he smelled, it mattered to him. And Hart, he was different too. Like he was hearing something I couldn't. The host gave a little theatrical pause. Both Marks and Hart reported finding a small white bead near the site. Its letter was worn, but some say it was an R. Some say, as if there were a committee of ghosts issuing carefully redacted statements. I almost turned it off. Then the host said something that froze me. "Since that episode first aired in a shorter form," she said, "we've heard from several listeners in the Longview area who claim to have had unusual experiences near Germany Creek, disembodied children's laughter, compass interference, strange dreams after visiting. One woman even reported waking up with dirt under her fingernails after dreaming she was digging beside a stump carved with a single word, unicorn." My phone buzzed with another text from my nephew. "Uncle Dan, this is wild. Is any of this true?" I didn't answer right away. The rational reaction would have been annoyance at Jocelyn for talking, frustration at the host for sensationalizing. Underneath that, though, something else stirred. A queer, unwelcome flicker of relief. If other people were dreaming of the stump, if strangers were being pulled toward that bend in the creek by forces they couldn't articulate, then maybe this wasn't all about me and my aging, guilty brain. Maybe the scene ran deeper than one retired cop. That night, for the first time, I played the tape in the dark. Not at my desk with a pen in hand, not in a training room with skeptical rookies, but in my living room with the lights off, the curtains drawn, the only illumination the faint glow of the player's tiny window. "State your name for the record, please," my own younger voice said. "Rima Traxler. Do you have a password, Rima? A special word you use with your mom and dad?" She hesitated, then giggled. "I'm not supposed to say." You don't have to say it, I told her. Just tell me if you remember it. Course I do, she said. It's my unicorn word. The tape hissed softly between phrases, that comforting analog static that always used to put me to sleep on stackouts. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me, stripping away the temptation to dissect every syllable. Do you ever feel unsafe walking home from school? I heard myself ask. Sometimes there's a car, she said. A blue car. It goes slow. Does he ever talk to you? Not yet, she said. But he smiles. Too much. Not yet. Not no. Not never. Even at 8, some part of her knew that danger could be something that waited. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, school, favorite cartoons, how unfair bedtime was, I felt the mood in the room shift. The hair on my arms prickled, the way it does when a storm is about to break, even if the forecast says clear. You said unicorns only come to good people, my taped self said near the end. How do they know who's good? They listen, she replied. They can hear your real voice, not the one in your mouth. The one in your chest. The one in your chest. The tape clicked off. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt expectant. All right, I said into the dim room, feeling more foolish than I had talking to that stump. You've got my attention. I'm listening. What now? No answer came in words. No spectral figure materialized at the foot of my recliner. But somewhere, out in the dark tangle of woods and water that had held her story for decades, something moved. You can call that projection. You'd probably be right. But you weren't there when the phone rang 5 minutes later. Caller ID flashing a number I hadn't seen since before smartphones. Detective Hart? The voice on the other end was male, mid-40s, with the particular strain of someone who'd been carrying a secret too long. This is Hart, I said automatically, old habits snapping into place. You don't know me, he said, but I think I was there. The day she went missing. I heard your podcast or whatever, and a shaky breath. I remember the car. For a second, all I heard was the blood rushing in my ears. The TV murmured to itself in the background, some canned laughter sitcom, completely out of step with the weight in the room. On the phone, the man cleared his throat and tried again. I was 9, he said. Back then, I didn't know what I was looking at. People say this kind of thing a lot once a case gets a spotlight. Memory is contagious. You put a story out there with enough vivid detail, and suddenly half the town is sure they saw a suspicious blue car or a man with a mustache. But there was something in this guy's voice, not the attention-hungry lilt of a fantasist, not the stiff recitation of someone reading off a forum thread. It was tighter, rawer, like every word had to squeeze past a fist around his throat. What's your name? I asked. Evan, he said. Evan Marsh. I lived on 22nd back then, couple streets over from the Traxlers. I used to walk home the same way as she did, sometimes. The name pinged somewhere in my memory's cluttered shelves. A half-legible note in an old statement. A kid who'd been walk route adjacent, as we used to say. One of a handful of children we'd talked to in the days after Rima vanished, their accounts blending together under the pressure of adults with clipboards. You talked to the police back then, Evan? I asked. Yeah, he said quickly. You don't remember? You came to the school, sat us in a circle in the library, asked if we'd seen anything weird. I said something about a blue car, and my teacher shushed me, said not to scare the younger kids. You talked to me after, but he trailed off. I didn't tell you everything. Not the way I remember it now. Guilt has a long half-life. It can sit dormant for decades and flare up at the slightest trigger. A news story, a podcast, a man's voice on a tape saying, "Do you have a password, Rima?" And a child's answer, "It keeps me safe." "What made you call tonight?" I asked. He hesitated. "The dream," he said finally. "I mean, they've always been around. But this one, it was like that podcast episode, but wrong. I was standing by a stump with a word on it. And there was a little girl there, but she wasn't 8 anymore. She was my age. 40-something. She said, 'You saw me, Evan. You saw him. Why didn't you speak?' And when I woke up, there was dirt under my nails. His laugh was brittle. I know how that sounds." I looked at the tape deck, still sitting on the table like a coiled question. "It sounds like your brain is trying very hard to get your attention," I said. "Tell me what you remember. Start with that day." The line went quiet except for his breathing. I heard him move, maybe sitting, maybe pacing. "It was a Wednesday," he said slowly. "I only remember that because we had chicken nuggets in the cafeteria on Wednesdays. I was walking home with my friend Tyler, but he turned off a couple blocks earlier than usual, 'cause his mom was picking him up for a dentist appointment. So I was alone." He described the stretch between the school and the intersection where Rima had last been seen by the neighbor. Kids, backpacks, the smell of fresh-cut grass. The things you only recall when you strip away the official language and let a memory be what it is, a flicker, not a sworn affidavit. "I heard a car," Evan said. "Old. You know how older engines sound different? More. Grindy. It came up behind me slow. I moved over, like we were taught. Stranger danger and all that. But it didn't pass. Just crawled. I remember thinking maybe they were lost." "Color?" I asked, already knowing and hating that I knew. "Dark blue," he said. "Kinda dirty. Like it hadn't been washed in a while. I didn't see the driver at first. Then it pulled up to the curb ahead of me, and she was there. 'Rima,' I said. Yeah, I didn't know her name then. Just that girl from the other class. She was on the sidewalk holding this cardboard thing, like art class. The guy leaned over and said something I couldn't hear. She took a step back. I remember that. Like when the dog smells something off in a person. My hand tightened around the phone. This was the moment. The fulcrum. Then, Evan said, I heard her say, 'What's the word?' Real clear, like she'd practiced it. And he laughed. Not loud, just this smug little sound. And he said it. 'Unicorn,' I finished, the word sour on my tongue. 'Yeah,' he whispered. She smiled. That's the part that I can't stop seeing that. Her face going from scared to relieved. She said okay and started to open the door. And that's when she looked up and saw me. I could picture it so easily it hurt. 2 kids, one on the sidewalk, one a few yards back. A car like a mouth opening between them. Her eyes got all big, Evan said. Not like she was afraid. More like she was checking. Like, is this okay? Is this normal? I didn't say anything. I just stared. I was 9. I didn't want to be rude, you know? My mom always said not to stare when grown-ups were talking, so I looked away. When I looked back, the car door was closing. She was inside. He drove off. The quiet on the line had a different quality now. Not just the pause of someone dredging up old images, but the fallout of finally saying them aloud. Did you see his face? I asked gently. Yeah, he said, once, as they passed me. He looked right at me and smiled. Too wide. Like his mouth didn't belong to his eyes. A shaky exhale. I saw his picture on the news years later, when you guys arrested him for that other girl. I almost threw up. It was him. Heat climbed up my throat. Why didn't you come forward then? Because by then you had him, he said, voice cracking. You didn't need me. And what was I going to say? Hey, remember that kid from the circle in the library who said something about a blue car? Turns out I watched her get taken and froze like a coward. That's not cowardice, I said. You were a child. Tell that to the girl from my dream, he muttered. She didn't look convinced. We sat with that for a moment. Let it sting. "All right," I said. "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to come in. We'll take a formal statement. I don't care if the case is technically closed. Additional witness detail is never wasted. And then, if you're willing, you're going to sit with a sketch artist. Not for him. We've got him. For the scene. Angles. Landmarks. Where you stood. What good will that do?" He asked, but there was less defeat in it than I expected. "It might help us narrow exactly where he stopped," I said. "Confirm or adjust our assumptions about his route. And it might help you," I added, "to put the memory somewhere other than your nightmares." He was quiet a long time. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, I'll come in." After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap, the tape deck in front of me, and the uneasy sense that something was coordinating moves on a chessboard I hadn't agreed to play on. A tape, a stump, a bead, a dog, a dream, a podcast, a witness whose guilt finally outweighed his fear of being foolish. You can call that coincidence. You could also call it what Linda had, in her tired, unwavering way, a child nudging. The next week was a blur of a kind I hadn't felt since before retirement. Not the adrenaline of a fresh homicide, all sirens and crime scene tape, but the slow, meticulous urgency of a case reopening its eyes. Evan came in on a Tuesday, shoulders hunched like he was walking into a principal's office instead of a police station. I met him in the lobby, gray hair, old suit, the ghost of the badge still stamped into my posture, and watched his gaze flick over the room, landing briefly on the corner where we'd once set up missing child tip lines. "You look exactly the same," he blurted, then flushed. "I mean, older, but the same. Occupational hazard," I said. "We get preserved in people's worst memories." In the interview room, without the weight of a full squad's eyes, he relaxed a fraction. His hands still shook when he signed the consent forms, when he repeated his story for the recorder. The details stayed consistent with what he'd said on the phone, with the old file notes, with what we knew of Joe's usual methods. The sketch artist, a patient woman named Ruiz, worked with him on a large pad, building the scene piece by piece. Where was the crosswalk, she'd ask. How far from the corner? Was there a tree? Slowly, the map of that afternoon took shape. When they finished, she swiveled the pad so I could see. Something in my chest clenched. We'd always assumed he'd picked her up closer to the main intersection, the point of last confirmed sighting. But Evan's recollection placed the stop a little further back. A narrower stretch, fewer houses with direct line of sight, and more importantly, a cleaner turn-off route toward Germany Creek that shaved a crucial minute from our old models. I thought of the stump, of Cairo, of the bead, of the persistent sense, standing in that damp hollow, that we had been brushing the edge of something without quite stepping over it. Could memory be off? I asked Ruiz quietly when Evan stepped out to take a call. "Always," she said. "But his internal landmarks line up with what I'd expect. And trauma sharpens some details, even if it blurs others. That smile, for example." She tapped the rough sketch of a man's face in profile, mouth stretched too wide. He described it the same way, 3 different times without realizing it. We added Evan's statement to the case file. On paper, it bolstered the narrative we already had. Joe used the password, exploited the family's safety net, took her toward the creek. In practical terms, it didn't magically conjure a body or alter a sentence already handed down. But in the undercurrent spaces, the ones not reflected in reports, it did something more subtle. It closed a loop of silence. A witness had spoken. A child's last glance backward had not vanished into the dark. That night, I dreamed again. This time, there was no stump, no carved word. Just the sound of a car engine idling and the particular hollow slam of a passenger side door. When I woke, my heart hammering, I realized the humming I'd half heard under the engine noise hadn't been the radio. It had been a child's voice, whispering something over and over. I sat there in the dark, forcing myself not to move until the last tatters of the dream settled enough to be examined. Whispered words are slippery. They don't stick unless you pin them quickly. At last they surfaced. "Not yet," she'd said. "Not yet, not yet, not yet." I didn't know if it was a memory of her earlier interviewer, answer about the man in the blue car who hadn't talked to her yet, or something stranger. A message, a reassurance, a warning. But it lodged in me, a small, insistent stone against the larger weight. Not yet can mean fear. It can also mean there's still something left to do. The next morning, I drove back out to Journey Creek, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and the tape in my jacket pocket. The sky was a low lid of cloud, threatening rain, but not quite committing. The kind of day that makes colors look more saturated, greens greener, browns deeper, the word unicorn on a stump side darker and more defiant. I sat on the same rock as before and for the first time played the tape out loud in the place that had been orbiting it for decades. "State your name for the record, please," my younger self said into the trees. Rima Traxler floated over water. It was absurd on its face. Audio doesn't interact with soil. Voices don't alter topography. But as her words spilled into the damp air, the woods seemed to retune. Birds quieted. The creak of branches stilled. Even the creek's burble felt like it had dropped a register. "Do you have a password, Rima?" "Yeah, but I'm not supposed to say." "You don't have to say it. Just tell me if you remember it." "Course I do. It's my unicorn word." I let the tape run through the parts I'd once fast, forwarded her talk of schoolyard dramas, of a teacher she thought didn't like her, of a brother who teased her about the barrette. Normal kid stuff, the life inside the file, not just the crime. When it reached the line about the man who smiles too much, a breeze picked up, shivering the ferns. A branch overhead nudged free a small shower of droplets that pattered around me like fingers. "You see him near your house?" I heard myself ask. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes by the trees. Sometimes by the water." The hair on my neck lifted. That line. I'd heard it before, obviously. I could have quoted most of the tape by then. But standing there, with damp soil under my boots and a bead in my pocket, it landed differently. Sometimes by the water. We'd always imagined him taking her straight from the curb to the most accessible patch near the road, a quick drop, a hurried burial, the way of a man who wanted to minimize his exposure. But Joe had been cocky. He liked ritual, control. Maybe he'd gone deeper in, to somewhere that felt special to him. Or to her. I turned slowly, letting the tape's hiss and her faint, stubborn voice be a kind of compass. There was the path we'd taken with Cairo. There was the root tangle where he'd pressed his nose to the ground. There was the stump. And there, just beyond the stump, was a narrow gap in the underbrush I'd never paid much attention to, a deer trail, no wider than my shoulders. The kind of path you notice only if you're small or paying very close attention. The kind of path an 8-year-old might think of as a secret way to the water. I don't know if it was the tape, the dream, the bead, or just the accumulation of years of not quite right that pushed me to step through that gap. Probably all of it, braided together like beads on a string. The trail dipped, then curved, the ground underfoot squishier, richer. After about 20 yards, the trees opened into a pocket of space I'd never seen mapped on any of our old grids. Not a clearing, exactly, but a sort of natural alcove, a small, flat bench of earth overlooking a bend in the creek where the water slowed, pooling deep and dark before spilling on. Someone, years ago or decades, had built a makeshift seat out of stones and a fallen log. On the log, barely visible under layers of moss, were faint carvings, hearts, initials, shapes that might once have been animals. And on the ground, half buried in damp soil, something plastic caught the light. It was ridiculous, in a way, how small it was. After everything, the years of searching, the tape, the dreams, the stump, the podcast, the witness, what lay half hidden in that damp patch of earth, looked like something you'd sweep up with dust bunnies at the back of a kid's closet. A thin, brittle loop of elastic, mostly rotted through, threaded with a few surviving plastic beads. The letters were warped, the paint flaked, but enough remained to make out their ghosts. I didn't touch it, not at first. Old instincts overrode the part of me that wanted to snatch it up like a relic from a shrine. I crouched instead, knees protesting, and just looked. It might have been anyone's. Kids all over America wore those name bracelets in the 80s. Time and weather could have carried it from a dozen yards away. But the same quiet certainty that had settled on me when I'd first heard her voice on that impossible tape slid into place again. This was hers. You could call that projection. You'd probably be right if you were grading by the Academy's standards. But out there, in that little natural alcove, it felt more like a room than any open patch of forest had a right to. The usual grading rubric didn't apply. I forced myself to stand, to backtrack, to mark the route with mental pins instead of emotional ones. Stump, narrow gap, dip, curve, bench, creek. Only then did I pull out my phone. "Don't tell me you found a body," my old lieutenant groused when he picked up. "I'm too old for the paperwork." "Relax," I said. "If I had, I'd have led with that. I need a scene tech, quietly, and someone from evidence who doesn't mind getting their shoes muddy." "Jesus, Hart, this again. Listen to me," I cut in, letting more steel into my voice than I'd used with him in years. "You remember how many times we combed this area. You remember how many parents called after every big storm, asking if we'd try one more time. I'm standing in a pocket we never mapped. There's a bracelet here. Her name. 4 letters. Elastic's rotten, but the beads are intact. You can pretend it doesn't matter, or you can send a couple of people out here and we can at least say we checked." There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear the murmur of the bullpen, the distant trill of phones, the same sounds I'd lived in for decades. "You're not on the clock anymore," he said finally. "You know that, right?" "Yeah," I said, "but she is. Has been since 1985. Another beat. Then, text me the coordinates. I'll see who's free." The techs who arrived 45 minutes later were younger than the beads at our feet. They moved with a competent efficiency I respected, but there was a layer of detachment to them, the way you get when you've grown up on true crime shows and assume every horror has already had its best angle lit. "This the famous Unicorn Creek?" One of them asked, not unkindly, as he unrolled a small perimeter tape. "Don't call it that," I said, sharper than I meant to. "It's Germany Creek. The girl's name was Rima." He nodded, chastened, and got to work. Photos, measurements, a careful lift of the bracelet into a clean evidence container, soil samples from beneath and around it. They treated that little patch of earth like it might hold a grenade, and in a way it did. Not a bomb, but a charge of memory that could go off in unexpected hearts. "Realistically," the senior tech said later, as we stood by the path, "age and conditions out here are going to make anything we get off pretty iffy. DNA, fibers after this long? It's a stretch." "I know," I said, "but you've logged it. It exists somewhere besides my pocket now. That's worth something." He studied me for a second. "You one of the original guys?" He asked. "Yeah. My mom used to talk about this case," he said. "Said it was the first time she remembered being afraid to let us walk to school alone. She flip when she hears we found." He trailed off, searching for a word that didn't cheapen it. Something. Not everything, but enough. Back at home, the house felt smaller, as if the discovery in the woods had shifted some internal geometry. The tape sat where I'd left it. The player's window reflected my lined face back at me. For a moment, I had the absurd thought that if I pressed play now, her voice would sound closer, as if distance could be measured not just in time, but in inches of soil reclaimed. I didn't hit play. Instead, I poured a drink I didn't need and sat at the table with a legal pad, doing what I'd always done when things threatened to float off into the realm of the unprovable. I made a list. Tape, dated the 10th of April, 85. My handwriting. No conscious memory of interview. Content matches later facts. K9 hit. Cairo's reaction near stump. No remains, but behavior consistent with old sense sight. Carving. Unicorn. On stump. Recent. Unattributed. Bead number 1. Found near stump. Faded R bead bracelet. Found at hidden alcove. Rima. Evans statement. Car position. Password used. Eye contact. Dreams reports. Multiple independent accounts of similar imagery near creek. Underneath, I wrote, in smaller letters, "What do you do with this?" There is no section in the investigative manual for potential supernatural corroboration. You can't put persistent ghost involvement in a probable cause affidavit. Judges tend not to respond well to "the victim's spirit led me here" when you're asking for a warrant. But the older I got, the less interested I was in what fit neatly on forms, and the more I cared about what fit the story the evidence was trying to tell, even if some of that evidence came in through side doors. So, what did the story look like now? Joe had taken her, that much we knew. He'd used the password, leveraged the family's trust, weaponized the one bit of magic they thought was theirs alone. He'd driven her toward the creek, maybe along a slightly different route than we'd assumed. He'd gone deeper in, to a spot that felt safe to him, or to her, or both. A place kids had used as a secret fort long before and long after 1985. There, he'd done what men like him do. And there, something of her had stayed. A bracelet, a scent trace, an echo. The justice system had done what it could with that. It had put him away, named his crimes, given the family something like closure. But the land, and the child whose life had been cut open on it, weren't done telling their parts. You might ask, to what end? If we couldn't bring her body home, if we couldn't change the outcome, what good did it do to chase beads and dreams and carved words? I asked myself that, too. The answer came, unexpectedly, from a direction I'd never sought. A woman named Dana, who introduced herself, over email, as a grief counselor specializing in unresolved loss. "I heard you speak at a training once," she wrote. "A colleague sent me the Cold Case Files episode. I work with families of the missing people who never get the confirmation a funeral provides. For what it's worth, the way you've been talking about Rima's case, it matters, even if you never find more. Even if all you prove is that someone took the time to look again." We met for coffee in a quiet corner of a strip mall bakery. She was in her 50s, kind eyes behind sensible glasses, a notebook always at hand. The kind of person people instinctively spill to and then feel embarrassed about later. "You're not here to therapize me, I hope," I said as we sat. She smiled. "Consider this pro bono, if anything. I'm more interested in how you understand what's happening. The tape, the finds in the woods, call it what you will, haunting," I said, surprising myself with the bluntness. "If that's your word," she nodded. We talked about practicalities first, her work, the way families of the missing often attach deep meaning to small, ambiguous signs. A song on the radio at the right moment. A dream, a found object. People need narrative, she said. If the world has torn a hole in theirs, they'll stitch with whatever threads they have. "You're saying I'm no different from them," I said. "That I'm building a ghost because I can't stand the empty space." "I'm saying you're human," she replied. "But I'm also saying something else." She leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes the thread they grab is, in fact, connected to something real. Just because a pattern gives comfort doesn't mean it's false. The danger is in assuming it's either all in your head or all external design. There's a middle ground, which is collaboration, she said, between grief and whatever else is out there. It was a maddeningly soft answer for a man who'd spent his life chasing hard ones. You think she's reaching out, I said. It felt strange, naming the possibility so plainly. I think, Dana said carefully, that when enough attention, love, anger, and unfinished intention pool around a place or a story, they leave a mark. Call it spirit, call it resonance. Some people are more sensitive to it than others. You clearly are one of them. So are some of the folks who've had those dreams. Whether that's her or some larger psychic footprint of what happened to her, I don't pretend to know. My job isn't to label it. It's to help people live with it. Linda doesn't want to hear the tape, I said. She told me that straight out. Says if she hears her daughter's voice again, she'll never be able to separate it from memory. That's her boundary, Anna said, and it's a wise one for her. Yours may be different. For you, listening seems to be part of how you stay engaged, how you honor the case. The question is whether it's also how you avoid moving on from it. I don't want to move on, I said. That phrase always felt like a betrayal to me. I want to move through, to somewhere that makes more sense. She considered me for a moment. Maybe this is that, she said. Not in the sense of, aha, here are the bones, roll credits, but in the sense of shifting your relationship to what you don't know. You went from we failed her to we got her killer, to something about this is unfinished. Now you're somewhere between I'm being haunted and I'm being invited to pay attention. There's growth in that. Growth, I muttered. At my age, the only thing that grows reliably is my list of pills. She laughed. Humor is good. Keeps you from tipping over into the deep end. Just remember, whatever is happening here, you don't have to solve it the way you solved other cases. You just have to witness it. Witness, not solve, not fix. Just stand where the scene shows and say, I see it. That night, I went home, took the tape out one more time, and did something I should have done years before. I made a copy in a modern format. Digital, backed up, labeled with more than my own scrawl. Not to send to TV producers or podcasters. To leave someday for whichever young detective inherits the stubborn habit of listening where others shrug. The bracelet went to the lab. As expected, the results were thin, no recoverable DNA. The plastic's composition put it broadly in the right decade, but that proved little. It could have been dropped there any time between 1983 and last, Tuesday by a kid playing Ghost Hunters. And yet, when the report came back, there was one small detail that made me sit a little straighter. Embedded in a crack in one of the beads was a microscopic fragment of something that wasn't soil. Not fabric, not hair, paint, specifically glitter paint. The kind kids use in art class when they've been promised they can go wild on a project. The lab couldn't match it to anything conclusive, too generic, too degraded, but in the photo, under magnification, the flecks were unmistakable. Tiny iridescent shards in a barely their arc. A rainbow. You can say that's reaching. I wouldn't argue. But I'd also sat in a living room in 1985 and heard a neighbor say, she had glitter everywhere. Said it was for her unicorn. I'd watched a little girl with glasses tell me. She had a rainbow in her hair. Rainbows, unicorns, beads, passwords. None of it, on its own, would ever meet the standard of evidence a court requires. Together, they met a different standard, the one set by a tired detective, who'd promised a mother he would never stop looking for any piece of her child. The world might still be hiding. So when people ask now, because they do, after the podcast, after the TV special, after the endless churn of online speculation, do you think she's still out there? I tell them the truth. Yes, I say, but not the way you mean. People assume closure is a single moment. A verdict read, a gavel dropped, a body found and laid to rest. In reality, it's more like erosion, a slow, uneven wearing down to the sharpest edges. Some parts of you smooth out. Others remain jagged, catching on things for the rest of your life. Rima's case proved that over and over. Every time it seemed like the town had reached some new plateau of acceptance, something would shift. A documentary, a rumor, a new missing child in another state with enough superficial similarities to reopen old scars, and the landscape would rearrange itself again. After the bracelet and the lab report, nothing traumatic happened. There were no sudden maps with X's, no anonymous bones turning up at a construction site. The department logged the find, updated the file with our new best guess at the spot where she and Joe had last shared air, and the official machine moved on. Other cases demanded attention. Other families found themselves staring at empty beds and grainy photos. The world, as it always does, refused to orbit a single lost girl forever. But under that official layer, something quieter persisted. People kept going out to Germany Creek. Some were locals who'd grown up on the story and wanted, in some way, to pay their respects. They left small offerings near the stump. A plastic unicorn toy here, a drawing there, a bracelet made of fresh beads spelling out a name the woods already knew. Others were true crime pilgrims, drawn by the podcast and the TV special, hoping to feel something, a chill, a presence, a brush with the uncanny they could post about later. A few came for reasons they couldn't articulate at all. I just felt like I should be here. One woman told me when I ran into her on the path one afternoon. She was about my age, walking with a careful, measured gait, a cane tapping the ground. My granddaughter sent me that episode about the password. Said it reminded her of a thing we used to do when she was little. I dreamed about a creek 3 nights in a row after that. Figured maybe it was easier to come say hello than keep pretending I didn't hear it calling. Hello to who? I asked. She looked at me as if the answer were self-evident. The girl, she said simply. The one with the unicorn. I didn't correct her. Didn't tell her that grief and suggestion can weave some very persuasive narratives. Instead, I watched as she knelt slowly, painfully by the stump and laid down a small, worn object. A button, bright pink, shaped like a heart. For my sister, she murmured. She went missing in 72. We never got even this much. Maybe your girl won't mind sharing. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe that little pocket by the creek had become more than a crime scene in absentia. Maybe it was a kind of informal memorial, not just for Rima, but for all the children whose stories ended with a question mark instead of a period. I started going out there less for answers and more to keep watch, witness the way Dana had framed it. Sometimes I'd sit on the stone and log seat and listen to the water, the wind, the occasional far-off rumble of a truck on the road. Sometimes I'd bring the tape, sometimes I wouldn't. I never stayed past dusk. It wasn't ghosts I was afraid of. It was my own tendency to see them in every shifting shadow. One late afternoon, as the light thinned into that gray-blue that makes the world look flattened, I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. Light, quick, kid steps. My hand tensed on the arm of the log, half ready with the kind of warning every adult in this town had wired into them since 1985. Careful where you walk, I called without turning. It slopes near the edge, a boy's voice answered. I know, my dad told me. I turned then. He was maybe 12, lanky, too long for his hoodie, with that in-between look kids get when childhood hasn't entirely let go, but adolescence has already grabbed an ankle. His hands were jammed in his pockets, shoulders hunched against a chill that hadn't fully settled yet. You're that detective, right? He asked. From the show. I used to be a detective, I said. These days I'm just a guy who owns too many old tapes. He smiled faintly at that. I'm Caleb, he said. My mom. She didn't want me to come. Says this place is too heavy. But my dad brought me once when I was little. I don't remember it much, just the feeling. Like being quiet in church, even when nobody tells you to. It does have that, I admitted. He looked past me, toward the water. Did they ever find her? Not in the way you're asking, I said. We found where she probably was. We found who took her. Sometimes that's the most the world lets you have. He nodded slowly, processing that. My dad says grown-ups tell kids not to talk to strangers, but most of the time the ones who hurt you aren't strangers. They're people your parents trust. That true? Yes, I said. No point softening it. It can be. That's why it's important to pay attention, not just to what someone says, but how they make you feel. If your chest voice, as she put it, says something's off, you listen to that, even if your parents like the person. The girl, he said. She said that? Chest voice? On a tape, I replied. She talked about how unicorns know who's good. Said they listen to your real voice, the one in your chest. He was quiet for a moment. I dreamt about her, he said then, in the same matter-of-fact tone kids use to announce they're hungry. Before I knew her name, this was last year, I think, before my dad showed me the episode, there was a girl by a creek. She asked me if I knew the word. I thought it was like a password to her treehouse or something. I said no. She said, good, and then I woke up. A small chill traced my spine. You tell anyone? I asked. He shrugged. Mom said it was because I read too many spooky books. Dad just looked at me funny, like he wanted to say something and didn't. You having those dreams now? I asked. He shook his head. No. Feels quieter, like she moved seats. Moved seats? Yeah. He glanced around, searching for an analogy. Like when you're on the bus and there's someone sitting right behind you and you can feel them even if they're not touching you. Then they get off or they move up front. You still know they were there, but the pressure's gone. He dug his toe into the dirt. That doesn't make sense, does it? It makes plenty of sense, I said. More than some of the reports I filed. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think she's stuck. Everybody online keeps talking about restless spirits and unfinished business, like she's pacing around mad at everyone. I don't get that vibe. What vibe do you get? He frowned, squinting at the water as if the right words might be floating on its surface. Like she left some part of herself here on purpose. Not 'cause she couldn't leave, but 'cause she wanted to leave a bookmark for people like you. People like me? People who can't let go, he said, then flushed, realizing how that sounded. I mean, no, I said, amused despite myself. You're not wrong. He hesitated. If you see her again, he said, as if this were a perfectly normal thing to suggest, tell her thanks for making everyone pay more attention. My little sister walks home from school with like 5 different neighbors now because of her. It sucks for my sister, but, you know, in a good way. I'll pass it along, I said. He nodded, satisfied, and tromped back up the trail, whistling something tuneless. Halfway up, he stopped, turned, cupped his hands to his mouth, and called down, Hey, Rima, thanks for the unicorns. The echo of his voice bounced off the trees. For a fleeting second, I thought I heard another sound layered under it, a high, delighted giggle, the kind kids make when adults say something unexpectedly right. By the time I told myself not to be fanciful, the moment had passed. Later, turning that encounter over in my mind, I kept thinking about his phrasing. Not free her, not lay her to rest. Just thanks, gratitude, not pity, recognition, not rescue. Maybe that was what had been bothering me, under all the supernatural talk and the investigative regret. We'd framed Rima's story publicly, institutionally, as one of failure and tragedy. The password failed. The adults failed. The system failed. She was, in every retelling, the powerless one, the one acted upon. But if you looked at the ripples instead of just the stone, another pattern emerged. Because of what happened to her, parents in our town and later, in a much wider radius, rethought how they taught their kids about safety. They didn't just hand out passwords like talismans and assume that was enough. They talked about context, about gut feelings, about the fact that evil can wear a familiar face and can learn your magic words if you're not careful. Because of the unanswered questions around her case, advances in investigative practice interview techniques, evidence storage, interagency cooperation got tested against her file like a whetstone. If a new tool or method couldn't move the needle on something as stubborn as Rima's story, it wasn't worth much. Because of the tape, whatever you believe about its origins, whole rooms full of, young detectives heard a dead child's voice reminding them, in her own words, that unicorns don't need helpers, that passwords are only as strong as the people who guard them, that paying attention to the chest voice matters as much as any checklist. And because of the way her story refused to stay neatly in its box, people like Evan and Caleb and that woman with the cane found themselves engaging with their own ghosts in new ways, admitting things, thanking people, laying down beads with names that weren't theirs, but might as well have been. None of that undid what happened by that creek in 1985. It didn't erase the fear on her walk home. The moment her relief at hearing the password turned to confusion, and then to something far worse. It didn't bring a body back from the mulch and the roots. But it meant that, even in the face of a man like Joe, in a world like this one, an 8-year-old girl's love of unicorns, rainbows, and secret words had helped shape a different kind of magic. Vigilance, connection, stubborn remembrance. If that's not a haunting, I don't know what is. Not the kind that rattles chains or slams doors, but the kind that lingers in habits and policies and the way a whole town watches its children cross the street. One evening, near the end of all this, though I didn't know it was the end yet, I sat in my living room with the tape in the player and the volume low. Outside, rain ticked against the window in that steady Pacific Northwest rhythm, the kind of night made for remembering. On the tape, my younger self was wrapping up. "Is there anything else you want to tell me, Rima?" he asked. There was a pause. Then, "If I forget the word, will they still know it's me?" My recorded self fumbled. "Who?" he asked. "The unicorns," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "If I don't say the word, will they still find me?" "You won't forget," he said, "and they'll always find you." Sitting there decades later, older and far less certain, I felt a lump rise in my throat. It was such a simple, earnest question from a child whose world still had room for magic that did what it was supposed to do. If I don't say the word, will they still find me? Maybe that was what all of this had been about. The tape, the stump, the bracelet, the dreams, the podcast, the boy on the trail calling out thanks to a girl he'd never met. Not a demand for revenge or an insistence on bones, but a quieter, fiercer request. Don't forget the word. Don't forget me. We hadn't. Not really. Not for long. And in return, she'd left us a password of a different kind, one that, even now, all these years later, still opens something in the people who hear it. The older you get, the more your life starts to feel like a stack of unsolved files. Some are small, a conversation that ended badly, a road not taken. Others are heavier. People you couldn't save, cases that never quite closed, promises that outlived the circumstances in which you made them. Rima's file sat at the bottom of that stack for decades, warping everything above it. Even after Joe was sentenced, even after the tape surfaced, even after the bracelet and the bead and the stump and the creek, there was always that one line in my handwriting on the inside cover. Location. Unresolved. It wasn't just about a patch of earth on a map. It was about where to put her in my own story. The invitation to speak came from a place I hadn't expected, a middle school. "Mr. Hart," the email began, from a counselor named Miss Jenkins. "We're doing a community safety and media literacy unit with our 8th graders. Many of them have watched or listened to content about the unicorn password case without much context. We'd love if you could come talk about it, not the gory details, but the lessons. About trust, about how crimes actually get solved, about what we owe each other's kids." My first instinct was to decline. I'd spent years avoiding becoming a talking head. The old cop wheeled out to say a few grave words and then fade into B-roll while ominous music swelled. But this was different. No cameras. Just a room full of 13-year-olds who had grown up in a world where stories like Rima's were available on demand, sandwiched between makeup tutorials and gaming streams. I thought about Caleb on the trail, about the woman with the cane, about Linda's voice on the phone when she asked if her daughter sounded happy on the tape, about a little girl asking, "If I forget the word, will they still find me?" I said yes. The cafeteria smelled the way school cafeterias always do, disinfectant, old milk, whatever they'd served for lunch, clinging to the air like a rumor. They'd set up a projector, but I asked them not to use it. No slides, no photos, no dramatization. Just kids in plastic chairs and a tired man with a story. Most of them had at least heard of the case. A few wore that particular expression, the mix of morbid curiosity and moral distance that true crime content breeds. For them, horror was something you consumed, not something that might move in next door. "I'm not here to scare you," I began. "You get enough of that from your phones. I'm here to tell you about a girl who lived in this town a long time ago, who loved unicorns and glitter, and felt very proud the day she learned a secret password. I'm here to tell you what went wrong, and what's gone right since, because of her." I told them the basics. A walk home in 1985, a family who did what they thought was right, a man who used a word meant for safety as a key, a town that searched the woods until its feet bled, a case that went cold, then warm, then something stranger. I did not linger on the worst parts. I'd seen what that did to people's faces, how it turned victims into spectacle. Then I told them about the tape. "Sometimes," I said, "the past doesn't stay where you put it. Sometimes it reaches forward and taps you on the shoulder. In my case, it did that with a cassette labeled in my own handwriting, with an interview I didn't remember doing, dated a month before she disappeared. Hands shot up. They wanted to know if I thought it was really a time slip, or a glitch, or someone messing with us. They wanted to know if the bead had definitive proof attached. They wanted to know if ghost hunters had ever gone out to the stump at night. I answered what I could. "I don't know why the tape exists the way it does," I said. "I know memory is tricky and records can be wrong. I also know that conversation on that tape lined up with things we didn't learn until much later. You can call that an unsolved technical anomaly. You can call it a haunting. What you can't call it is irrelevant. It changed how I saw the case. It made me listen harder." One girl in the front row, braces catching the fluorescent light, raised her hand slowly. "Do you think she knows?" she asked. "Like, wherever she is. Do you think she knows people still talk about her?" That question, more than any about DNA or timelines, hit me square in the chest. "I hope so," I said. "If there's anything on the other side of all this, I hope one of the things it lets you see is how much you mattered. Not just to your family, but to people who never met you." Another kid taller, hiding behind his hair, asked, "Do you feel like guilty? That you didn't save her?" "Yes," I said, "and no." Yes, because when you wear a badge, you take on a responsibility that exceeds your actual power. You think you should have caught every monster, closed every door, read every sign correctly. And no, because one man didn't fail her. A whole culture did. A culture that thought telling kids a password and assuming only strangers were dangerous was enough. A culture that didn't yet understand patterns like Joe's. It took more than just my guilt to change that. It took her story, told and retold, to push those changes through. We talked about passwords then. Not unicorn ones, but the kind they used online. The kids were fluent in two-factor authentication and phishing scams. They knew not to give out their codes to someone texting from your bank. But when I asked how many of them would go with a friend's uncle if he said, "Your mom's at the hospital. She told me to come get you," more hands went up than I was comfortable with. That's the point, I said. The danger has always been this. Bad people watch how we try to keep ourselves safe and figure out how to turn those very tools against us. It's not about living in fear. It's about understanding that safety isn't one magic word or one rule. It's layers. It's listening to that chest voice, the way she talked about. And it's about adults doing their damn jobs, so kids aren't the only ones carrying the burden. Afterward, a few students came up, lingering while their classmates filed out. One boy, Freckles' serious eyes tugged at his sleeve and said, "My little sister made a unicorn bracelet after she saw that show. She said it was for the girl. Is that, like, disrespectful?" "I think," I said, "if your sister made it with care, it's the opposite. It's a way of saying, I see you. I'm still thinking about you. Just make sure she understands the real lesson, too. That magic words don't work on everyone. That some unicorns are just horses in bad costumes." He snorted at that, then sobered. "Do you ever wish you'd never taken the tape out of the drawer?" He asked. I thought of quiet nights with the hiss of analog static and a child's voice, of creek water and carved letters and dreams, of a bead so small it would have been easy to miss. "No," I said, even when it made things harder. Especially then. When I left the school, the sun was bright, kids spilling out onto the sidewalks, backpacks bouncing. For a second, from the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of rainbow in a girl's hair, a barrette catching the light. She turned, laughing at something her friend said, and the illusion broke. Different century, different child. Same fragile line between home and whatever waits if that line is crossed. I went back to Germany Creek one last time that week. I don't know why I thought of it as last. Maybe something in me had decided the loop was as closed as it was going to get. The air was cool, but not cold. Sunlight mottled through the leaves. The stump's carved word had softened under weather, the letters wearing down at the edges. New offerings had joined the old. A tiny plastic horse with a snapped horn someone had taped back on. A laminated drawing of a rainbow. A note in wobbling kid handwriting that read, "I won't go with them, even if they know the word." I sat on the log in the alcove, listening to the creek. No tape this time. No questions prepared. Just presence. "Here's where we are," I said quietly, feeling ridiculous in doing it anyway. "He's gone, locked away. Other kids are looking over their shoulders a little more. Parents are a little more suspicious of charm. Cops are a little more thorough with their notes. You're still missing in the way we can measure with shovels and maps, but not missing in the way that matters most." A breeze lifted the hair at the back of my neck. Somewhere overhead, a crow cawed. My knees ached, my back complained, the way old bodies do when you sit too long on unkind wood. "If you were 8 now," I said, "you'd have been my age by the time all this played out. Maybe you'd have kids of your own. Maybe you'd be the mom writing passwords on sticky notes for them, just in case. Maybe you'd hate that your name became a lesson instead of a person. I don't know. All I can say is this: we heard you, eventually, through all the noise. For a long moment, there was nothing but the creek. Then a single leaf, golden brown and late to fall, detached itself from a branch above and drifted down in a lazy spiral. It landed on the ground in front of my boots, face up. Someone had written on it in thin black ink, the letters small but legible despite the leaf's veins. "Thank you." I stared at it, throat tight, rational explanations lined up dutifully. A kid, out here earlier, playing some game. A coincidence of timing. Ink that happened to stay legible just long enough for me to stumble across it before rain smeared it into pulp. Or an answered question. "Right back at you, kid," I said. My voice came out rough. For the tape, for the creek, for the damn unicorns. On the walk back to the car, the woods felt not lighter exactly. The place where a child died and a predator fed doesn't become a fairy grove just because an old man finally learned how to listen. But something in the weight shifted. It felt less like walking through an unsolved problem and more like leaving a room where a long, hard conversation had finally come to a natural pause. Not an end. Stories like this don't get endings that satisfy everyone. There was no grave to visit, no headstone to clean. The file still had location, unresolved, scrawled inside. Somewhere, in another timeline, another version of me might have found bones in time for a proper funeral. That man lives only in my imagination. This version drove home, put the tape in a box with a few other relics, a badge, a pair of cufflinks from a partner long gone, the first commendation letter that had ever made his parents proud, and labeled it with 3 words, unresolved but heard. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the only glow comes from the blue digits of the microwave clock, I catch myself listening for the hiss of old tape. It's not there anymore. I put the player away, donated it to a small local museum that wanted to an exhibit on analog crime solving in a digital age. Let them decide what stories to tell. Every so often, though, as sleep closes in, I hear a different sound. A child's giggle. Distant, faint, not quite sensed any memory I can place. It doesn't scare me. It doesn't feel like a demand. It feels like someone, somewhere, remembered the word, even after everything. Unicorn. A silly, fragile little password, born in a living room out of love and fear and glitter. A word that failed in one terrible, specific way, and yet, somehow, succeeded in another by echoing long enough and loud enough to make a tone, a system, and an old detective change how they listened. If I forget the word, will they still find me? Yes, kid. We did. Just not where we first thought to look.